Hi there, welcome back to 19th century art. In this lecture, we're going to examine Post-Impressionism, the art movement that was fueled by the ideas of Impressionism and really is the beginning of this new modern expressive art. So we last looked at Impressionism. We talked about the way which artists like Monet and Degas and Cassatt and Meursault were trying to capture the qualities of light, trying to examine everyday life, trying to capture the kind of intimacy that can come from painting outdoors, from being in the company of real people instead of models, and trying to look at life as it is being lived by people all around us. In Post-Impressionism, we carry many of those same ideas, but what is the dramatic shift you can see here is that Post-Impressionism is experimenting with brushwork, that the facture, the individual artist brings this way of working to the surface of the canvas, and that is really where people are seeing this signature, this quality of their vision. Now, Post-Impressionism really is a direct outgrowth of Impressionism in so many ways, and it was from some of the last Impressionist exhibitions. There were 8 all told between 1874 and 1886. And it was Georges-Pierre Seurat who was the one who began to really try out this technique of pointillism in a new approach to Impressionist style painting. Now, it didn't begin all at once, this new technique of his. He was, like many of the Impressionists, interested in the work and life of ordinary people. And here he shows an early picture on the bathers at Seurat. This was in 1884. He's showing the working class people on holiday, mandated weekend holidays on Saturday, who were part of this new program by the government to improve the quality of life. And so they would gather on this bank of the Seine and this beach, and this was known for where the working class people were. And you can see in the background the factories where they would have worked. One smokestack is still burning. So there's a sense that most of the factories are shut and closed, and there are this desire just to relax, take in the day, ordinary people. Now, the way that Seurat worked on his painting was that he would do individual studies, he would have models, and then he would carefully look at the values he wanted to. He'd study the gestures, the actions, and really get the tonal qualities just how he wanted in his soft charcoal drawings. And then he would do an overall, very small painting, blocking in where he wanted all the colors. And then he would attack this rather large painting, combining these various studies all together. Now, he always imagined that this was to be the first of 2 paintings. On the other side of the River Seine is the park where the middle class would go on their holiday. And this became this very famous painting that really goes out in a wholly new direction, where he starts to employ this idea of pointillism. He also paints this border around the painting. He's working in a much more stylized manner. The figures are blocks. It's more playful. It's more peculiar. There's a lot of things about this picture which is a bit of a mystery. And because it represents the middle class, there's a sense of unreality to it, because I think this is really a new concept, the middle class. And as a group, it is a rather amorphous group of people whose class has risen and there are people whose class has fallen. And so the middle class in this time is a kind of amorphous collection of people, and that's represented in the eclectic and strange characters we see in this painting, like this very large woman right in front of us who has this monkey on a chain. Now, she's with a man, she looks married, she looks very respectable in this, but the exotic animal is actually a trait that was often associated with women who were prostitutes. And so, who is this woman? What is her status? Why does she have a monkey? Anyways, this is part and parcel of this world that Seurat paints in this new technique that he is developing. And he saw this technique as an outgrowth of his political socialist ideas, the way in which the paints mix together, the way in which the colors press up against each other but remain individual in their own identity. And this is part and parcel of this whole vision he was trying to communicate through what became known as pointillism. Later, once he had established this, he went back to his earlier painting and reworked it with more clearly defined dots. So, the standard definition of pointillism is that it is a painting with small, distinct points of primary colors to create the impression of a wide selection of secondary and intermediary colors. Okay, and it gives us a breakdown: what are primary colors, what are secondary colors, and what are the intermediary colors. Now, just looking at this example that you see from this definition, you have to come to the conclusion that those words are wrong, because right in front of me I can see secondary and intermediary colors being painted. Pointillism is not color mixing. This is wrong. Pointillism grows out of Impressionism. And Impressionism, the theory of color, there was local color as the dominant element of the painting. Local color refers to the true color of the subject, e.g., green grass, blue sky, yellow flowers. And then, as appropriate, yellow-orange colors representing the sun's action be interspersed with the natural colors to emulate the effect of direct sunlight. So you have local color, and then you're implying a separate dabs of light which represent that light hitting the subject. Then in shadow, you avoid black, and you highlight colors such as blues and reds and purples to simulate the darkness and shadows. You're not going to model the shape in grays and blacks, but you're going to use these darker colors to create depth in the shadows. Then you have the treatment of reflected light, and then you take the point of contrast, creating dramatic and dynamic pulses of colors. Okay? And these were color theory that was widely known and practiced by all the Impressionists and all the Pointillists. So if we look at this, we can see the local color, the actual color of the object. We can see the light hitting the subject. And we can see the use of blues and dark reds to simulate the idea of shadow. And the shadows are not created through the use of blacks or grays. So you create this very vibrant, very exciting, dynamic painting. And George Seurat soon moved away from his interest in the leisure activities of the middle class and begins to take up a fascination with the circus. He did many paintings of nightlife and circus entertainments, but tragically he dies very young. It's not quite sure what he died of, possibly diphtheria, but his legacy is cut short. And the idea of post-impressionism really falls to yet another man with whom we are far more acquainted with, Vincent Wilhelm van Gogh. Now, he is such an extraordinary figure in the history of modern art, and we know so much about him through his many, many letters to his brother and his intimate relationship with his brother. He had a complicated life. In so many different careers, he comes to painting light, and then he just latches onto it with a kind of fierceness that this is the thing that he must do. that he absolutely has to succeed in. Now we can see in the self-portrait, and he did quite a number of them, we can see this pointillist brushstrokes that he has, this kind of breaking up of the form. We're seeing these dabs of light. This treatment of the surface is very rich and dramatic. And we get this image, this psychological portrait that is not trying to represent the actual background or the real colors of things so much as he's allowing for this emotional intensity to come through with the deep reds and greens. Now, Vincent van Gogh was deeply interested in the working class poor, and he did lithograph here, and we have a number of paintings that he did early on. He's starting out. He wants to focus on the plight of the poor. And his brother, looking at this work, is not too impressed. He tells him, no one's going to buy this. Everyone now is looking at this Japanese art. It's all very colorful. You got to find a way to insert some color into your work. Van Gogh gets a lot of financial support through his brother, who was an art dealer in the city. And it's through that connection that he sees this Japanese art. Here we have him imitating a woodblock print. Of course, he's doing these rather ridiculous pseudo-Japanese characters on the side. He's clearly infatuated with the exoticness of this, and he's painting it in oils, and so it feels a little chaotic in ways. But it's the composition that's really stimulating here. There's something about the way things are framed by Hiroshige that seems to excite him. He's seeing a new way of looking at art. Here's the original Hiroshige print next to Van Gogh's copy. And of course, Hiroshige is just an absolute master of subtlety and precision, but Van Gogh is searching for a way to create something dynamic, perhaps more than the compositions that he gets out of Japanese art. It's the way in which Hokusai draws in his manga prints, and we can see a direct correlation between the kinds of mark making that Hokusai uses, these dots and dashes and lines, and that Van Gogh would bring this into his own drawing. And Van Gogh did this because he was really trying to find a way to make his drawings become studies for his paintings. So he's really practicing the brushstrokes and the values he wants to get in his painting. We can see that correlation there. And as he began to collect and look at more Japanese art, he develops this very rich vocabulary for mark making that comes directly into his painting. Now, the big plan that Vincent van Gogh had was he loved the excitement of the city. He's got a group of artists there that are fueling all kinds of new ideas. He's excited about it, but he's living with his brother and he's driving him crazy. And so he knows that he needs to get out. And so he sets his sight on moving down to the south of France, this small provincial town, Arles. And there he is going to find a place where he can start an artist colony. This was his big plan. He has made this new friend, Gauguin, who is a very charismatic and popular man in the avant-garde art movements of Paris. And he willingly agrees to look into this idea with Vincent van Gogh. So Van Gogh goes ahead and rents a tiny room in Arles, and there we see this new light, this new quality of life, this looking at the life of simple, ordinary, rustic people. This is the thing that he was immediately responding to, was the life of the peasants and the ordinariness of provincial French life that he wanted to get back to outside of the city. So during the fall and winter of 1888, Vincent van Gogh and Paul Gauguin lived and worked together in Arles in the south of France, where Van Gogh eventually rented 4 rooms, and which was dubbed the Yellow House for its citron hue. And they began to plan this community as an alternative to Paris. So one of the things we look at when we see a Van Gogh painting is this very, very heavy application of paint. He was using a lot of new colors, paints, new kinds of paints, new kinds of colors were being scientifically created and commercially sold. And it was very exciting, vivid, intense colors. But he noted that they had a propensity to fade, that they had this very short ability to actually hold their own color. And so he hoped by applying them thickly that they would actually retain some of their intended color. But unfortunately, a lot of the Van Gogh art we look at today is really quite different than what it was originally intended. A lot of the hues and the deep reds and yellows have disappeared, and we see this shift toward green hues that come very strongly today. He went into a lot of these places, the bars and nightclubs, with this very hostile attitude of the outsider. He was not really welcomed in this community. They thought of him as a kind of strange man with peculiar habits. And so he views these social places as places that are corrupting and taking them away from the natural world around them. So he tries to express the terrible passions of humanity by means of red and green. Everywhere there's a clash and a contrast of the most alien reds and greens, the figures of little sleeping hooligans in the empty, dreary room in the violet and blue, the blood red and the yellow-green of the billiard table, for instance, contrast with the soft, tender Louis XV green of the counter, on which there is rose nosegay, the white clothes of the landlord, watchful in a corner of that furnace, turn yellow, turn lemon yellow, or pale luminous green. So it's interesting how he talks about his paintings in his letters to his brother. We get a lot of the moral values he's trying to communicate, the intensity of his feelings about what he's painting. He was also very excited about painting portraits of people he had befriended. This is a wonderful portrait of the postman Joseph Roland, who was actually more of a postmaster than a postman. And he had a relationship with him. He was always going there waiting for money from his brother. And so this portrait really tries to capture the personality of the person, not by representing them in an entirely realistic way. The background with this sort of abstract floral patterns swirling around is meant to convey some of the inner life of the person that is before Van Gogh in his portrait. Van Gogh was famous for his sunflowers, and he painted them quite often in his life. He was introduced to Paul Gauguin through the painting of sunflowers. Paul Gauguin saw them and praised them and said, "This is really true original work. You are really showing what those sunflowers are in your painting." Sunflowers had religious connotations to Van Gogh. They are images of the religious Christian faith that he had been brought up with as symbols of constancy. And so the sunflower, as it follows the sun across the sky, is that idea of devotion. And it really was a symbol for Van Gogh of his devotion to painting, his devotion to art. Here we see a painting by Paul Gauguin as the painter of sunflowers from 1888. We'll talk more about Paul Gauguin in our next lecture. Last Sunday at 4:30 in the evening, Vincent van Gogh, painter of Dutch origin, called at the brothel, asked for a woman called Rachel, and handed her his ear, saying, "Guard this object with your life." Then he disappeared. When informed of the action, which can only be that of a pitiful madman, the police went the next day to his house and discovered him lying on his bed, apparently at the point of death. The unfortunate man had been rushed to the hospital. So that's the police report from 1888. Van Gogh had gotten into a terrible argument with Gauguin. Gauguin had left, and despondent, he cut off his own ear. And we see this in a portrait. He is admitted to a sanatorium where he's perhaps suffering from a metabolic disease. And he had this underlying illness and heavy drink of absinthe and exposure to the poisonous chemicals in the paints he used. All this probably exacerbated his already fragile mental condition. We see in this picture on the back, he has included a reproduction of a Japanese print in its sort of lurid colors. And we see how it is framed by the side of his face, as if this is sort of the interior of his mind in this sort of chaotic way. He is deprived from paint and canvases during his time as he is recovering. And when he finally gets a chance to paint again, he goes to the hospital where he's been staying all this time. And this is the first picture he had from a scene he looked at often from the window of where he was. And this is very simple laborer working the fields. And we see this undulating, surging colors of life. He really goes now very strikingly into this radiating brushstrokes, this very passionate action to examine the form of the land and sky as seething with this emotional intensity. This painting came up for auction. Works by Van Gogh are all held by very prestigious museums. Very rarely do they come up for auction. And this one is sold in 2017 for $81 million. So perhaps the most famous painting by Vincent van Gogh is his Starry Night from 1889. He is trying to capture the vividness and the intensity of the luminous night sky and the swirling colors. We have the cypress tree surging up from the lower left and the cityscape and the rolling hills behind and trees. It's a really extraordinary painting. If you're ever in New York and you're going to the Museum of Modern Art, it's there. It's really a treat. Now, interestingly, this is the time at which Paris had just opened up the Eiffel Tower. And it's been supposed that one of the ideas that Vincent van Gogh had for this painting, that the cypress tree and the natural beauty, this is to him where true beauty and natural wonder exists. That this man-made monstrosity, the Eiffel Tower, is nothing compared to the beauty of the natural world. And I think that's, again, him trying to push back against the rising tide of modernism and industrialization, that there was this desire to reassert the beauty of the natural world. I think Van Gogh himself felt that he'd gone a little too far here in this painting, even though this is a very famous painting and that it's a very expressive painting, and anyone who's ever seen Van Gogh is certainly aware of this picture. It's not his personal favorite, and in fact, perhaps not mine either, because it just seems a little busy and overworked. A painting which is really much more delicate and which was in the pride of place in his parents' home, one that he given to his brother as a special gift, was this exquisite painting of the almond blossoms. The delicacy, the luminous qualities, there's a real strong feeling of the Japanese composition of looking at nature. It's just a wonderful, exquisite painting that doesn't have any of that excess, but it really feels celebratory and delicate in a way that many of his later paintings exhibit. Dr. Gachet was a man who took Vincent in and was helping him as a psychologist interested in artists. And he lived and he worked with Vincent and helped him try and understand his emotional mood swings, and he encouraged him to paint. He seen that Vincent felt more in control of his life as he was painting, and he was happier. He was genuinely feeling upbeat about his paintings and about his work at this time. We start to see much more dynamic, vibrant uses of line work in his later art in the 1890s. So he begins with a pencil sketch, and then he adds the oil paint and watercolor in many different shades of blue. And he sort of begins like a drawing and then slowly builds up from that the deeper, richer colors. We can really feel how his paintings really begin as drawings. Now, this is often considered the last painting that Vincent van Gogh would make. We see these wheat field with crows. There's something very ominous about it, and people often point to this picture and its dark symbolism of foreboding, the crows fleeing. There's a sense of danger in the dark afternoon sky. And so people look at this and goes, yeah, the guy was troubled. And this is why he kills himself. But this is not his last painting, and there isn't any real evidence that his painting, his actual last painting, was something that indicated that he was on the verge of suicide. This is more accurately believed to be his last painting. It is unfinished. It's a painting, full of life and light and movement and action as he's trying to work through a very complicated composition of tree roots. The brother-in-law of Vincent's brother Theo described it in a letter. The morning before his death, he had painted a forest scene full of sun and life. Yeah, the death of Vincent van Gogh is surrounded in mystery. He shoots himself. He claims he took out a gun, a pistol, and shot himself in the stomach. It's just peculiar that he would shoot himself in the stomach, which is probably the most terrible way to try and kill yourself, because you're not going to get any vital organs and you're just going to slowly bleed to death, which he did. It took him days. The surgeon was called, but he looked at the wound, and even though the surgeon was skilled in extracting bullets, he decided that it was far too dangerous to try and perform an operation. And so Vincent van Gogh, on his deathbed, his brother Theo comes to him as he dies. And it's really sad it comes to this. We don't know how this man, really wanted to live. He struggled mightily against the prejudices of people. He was seen as a madman and a lunatic and a loser by the community that he surrounded himself in. And yet he felt this such determination to paint. And so his story is really what we have in many ways hung on to. And we have this idea of this person, even if that were absolutely true, that I am this loser, then I should one day like to show by my work that such an eccentric, such a nobody has in his heart. And so this is the story of Vincent van Gogh, which was popularized massively in this popular movie, Lust for Life, 1956. Here's Kirk Douglas performing it with this rather eccentric hat with candles on it. It just shows you the extent to which Vincent was driven to paint at all hours. He'd wear this crazy hat with candles because he wanted to paint at night. There's no evidence that Vincent ever owned or had such a hat, but it's just this crazy image of him from this movie that is so enigmatic, that's so memorable. After Vincent's death, Theo, his brother, dies 6 months later, and it's only Theo's wife, Johanna van Gogh Bonger, who compiles all of their thousands of letters, there's massive volumes, translates them all into English, edits them, and publishes them. And it's from this huge corpus of letters that we have such an insight into the mind of Vincent van Gogh. And this is what has been driving scholars and people into an interest in Vincent van Gogh. We have this incredible tale to tell about this artist, much more detailed than we often have for many artists of this time.